Welcome, everyone, to the Sterling Council's 2025 Summer Learning Series. My name is Laura McNeil. I'll be your host for each of the 6 weekly sessions, starting with today's session and running through August 20th. The objective of our Summer Learning Series is to provide insights on 2 of the Sterling Leadership's framework core components. The first one is ADLI. ADLI stands for Approach, Deployment, Learning and Integration, and it focuses on optimizing our processes used by our organizations. The second is LeTCI. LeTCI is a technique that stands for levels, trends, comparisons, and integration, and it focuses on operational performance monitoring. You might have noticed that both of these techniques end with integration because they're both integrated into each other, just like a crossword puzzle. The L in the ADLI, the ADLI, Approach, Deployment, Learning, and Integration, the L for learning is the intersection for the L that we see in LeTCI for levels. In order to walk us all through ADLI and LeTCI and appeal to the variety of understanding that we all have in regard to what ADLI and LeTCI mean, we've designed our discussions over the course of these next 6 weeks to be very rudimentary examples, leveraging very rudimentary examples of restaurants. You know, we've all gone out to eat. We can all relate to being in a restaurant and what we expect to see as good practices. We've also assembled a great group of Sterling Masters to facilitate each of these sessions. Our speakers do include Roland Martinez. Roland is our Sterling Council Board President. He's also an inventor. He's a former restaurant owner, and he is the Deputy Director of the Broward County Health Department. Roland will be kicking us off today with this introductory session, and he'll also come back to close us out in week 6 with a final Q&A. We also have Gordon Klein, who is the CEO of Reflect Excellence, LLC, and Gordon will be covering approach and deployment portions of ADLI in session 2. Nicole Solomon, who is the Executive Director of Solomon Leadership Solutions, will be covering learning and integration portions of ADLI in session 3. Anthony Napolitano, who is a very seasoned project manager, Scrum Master. He's an agilist and a product owner in the financial industry. We'll be covering LeTCI in totality. LeTCI is also something that we refer to as results in session 4. And then in session 5, we'll have Dr. Samson Golston, who's the department chair for Industrial Manufacturing and Systems Engineering at the University of Texas at Arlington, present and discuss the use of scoring for the identification of our organizational maturity. Each of the sessions will be broken into 4 parts. We'll start out with a welcome and a recap from any previous sessions. We'll have our presenters present the new material. I'll present a summary recap of that new material that was covered, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A session that will facilitate through the chat window in this session. And keep in mind, for those questions that we don't get to, we will be providing responses along with a video recording of the session at the sterlingcouncil.com webpage in the Summer Learning Series section. So with that, Roland, if you're ready to roll, I'll be turning it over to you to walk us through the introduction.
Okay. Hi, Laura. It's been a while since I've seen you on the screen. It's what's this? Our 4th series, I think, with regards to our summer learning series. So I'm really excited. I know that everyone on the calls is pretty excited. We have almost 100 people on the call today, which is like an amazing participation level that we have here. So really excited about this. We just started to present these two components of Sterling because for all intents and purposes, it's the secret sauce that we have with regards to organizational organizational evaluation and establishment of your processes and your metrics inside of your organization. So, Gordon, who's out there, I know that Laura mentioned him. Gordon had the great idea of for a case study kind of view, to use restaurants, because we've all had some contact, like Laura said, we've all had some contact with restaurants out in the world. We go out to eat. That's one of the things that humans have to do, right? They have to eat. And so, and a lot of the analogs that you're going to see, there's a lot of analogs with regards to what goes on in the restaurant business to what goes on in other segments of the economy with regards to process and with regards to measurement. So with that, let's go ahead, I guess, and get started here. Laura already started to work this out with everybody, but I want to introduce it again. So ADLI, approach deployment, learning, and integration. ADLI establishes how we get work done, primarily, right? So if we're looking at this from a point of view of the organization itself versus examiners, right? Because we do things a little bit differently with ADLI as we look at it and how we utilize it as examiners. But if we look at it from the organizational point of view, ADLI really establishes how we get work done, right? How do we solve the problems that we want to solve in our organizations, and how do we meet those valid customer requirements that we may have, that we have from our customer groups? And then LeTCI evaluates how well those processes are working, right? And so it tells us what's going on, how well those processes are meeting those requirements, and setting out and comparing us to others in the environment that we may see, because just looking at ourselves by ourselves really doesn't tell us if we're moving in the right directions, specifically. And so both help to identify both the strengths and gaps through evaluation. So even though you're utilizing these in your organization to be able to establish process and be able to define metrics, the truth is that you can use both the ADLI and LeTCI frameworks to be able to evaluate how well your processes are working, and how whether or not you're achieving the performance that you really want to achieve. Okay. And so let's jump into ADLI here. So I put up on the screen what's ADLI. ADLI, so that because we say that a lot, right? And it's an acronym for approach, deployment, learning, and integration, but we just affectionately call it ADLI. So if you hear examiners talk about it, or you hear the Sterling Council talk about it, that's really what we're talking about. And so approach is about your processes, right? Everything happens through process in organizations. Everything happens through process. You got to be able to do some kind of work. You have some kind of deliverable that has to be, that you've decided that you want to partake in, or you want to engage in, or you want to produce a widget, whatever that is. There's going to be some kind of input that goes on, and some conversion process, things that you add value to during the to those inputs to be able to create outputs. And so that's how you get work done. So when we talk about approach, we're talking about what are the steps that you utilize to be able to make those things happen. What are those processes, and how are they put together to be able to create the business, for all intents and purposes, that you're engaged in? Deployment is really about how and where those processes are applied and who uses them, right? And so how does that happen in your organization? So if you have an approach, who utilizes that approach, and is it consistently applied in the organization? Okay. And so we look at that with regards to deployment in the organization. So does everybody know they're supposed to do X? Right. I'm going to get into that with the examples later, but just as the overview. Learning is really about knowledge through evaluation, right? How do we improve it? How do we benchmark against others? How do we know that our processes are moving in the direction that we want them to move, achieving what they want to achieve? And how do we go about looking at its performance, those process performance, to be able to improve it over time, right? Because I've said it before, I've said it 1,000 times. The only thing that can improve in the world are dead things, and organizations are living, breathing organizations are living, breathing, entities, and so they change over time. The requirements that are placed on them, the challenges that they have, all of that goes on. How well people come into the organization, move out of the organization. So how well do we do we learn in our organizations from the processes that we're doing? How do we evaluate that? And then finally, integration, right? So integration's kind of like, I've explained it before. Integration is really like the barrel of monkeys approach, right? What's the interconnectedness? How does it link to other processes in the system? Okay, to be able to create some outcome or output. And so that interrelatedness of process is really what we term integration. How does it work with other systems? Okay, and so our example that we're utilizing is this, our neighborhood restaurant, right? So we're using that. And so, our intention here over the next 6 weeks is not to teach you how to run a restaurant, right? They're extraordinarily complex animals, just like other businesses in the world. But we wanted to use something and an analog that had, an example that had analogs out there in the real world, so that you kind of wrap your head around it. So if we're really talking about restaurants, right? And we're really talking about the systems in restaurants. Restaurants are really separated into 3 functional systems, at the 40,000 foot level, right? So you have the front of the house. That's the technical term for that segment of a restaurant, is the front of the house. And that's really encompasses the service system. So people that work there, are the people that you typically, as a patron, you come in contact with most, right? So those are the hostess, the wait staff, the bussers, those folks inside of the system, inside of that front of the house system, that does that. And so the processes that are engaged there, the processes that you touch in the front of the house, are reservations, seating, order taking, serving, checkout. Most people have contact, with all of this part of the system, right? But there's this other part of the system, right? The production part of the system, right? That's back of the house, right? That's what it's termed. And that's really where all production happens. Is, because restaurants have, all of the problems of retail sales and all of the problems of service and all of the problems of those 2 areas, right? Of production and of service. And so in the back of the house, we have the chefs, we have the cooks, we have the dishwashers, we have those folks that are involved in producing whatever it is that you're ordering. And so we've got, those processes back there, or ordering, receiving, storage, production, food prep. There's a bunch of these. They're on the screen. I'm not going to read them all to you. Okay. And then you have the support system of the organization, right? Which is really management, right? They engage in, it's either, it's the general manager, typically front of the house manager, back of the house manager. And they're involved in things like payroll and maintenance and scheduling and hiring, financial, all that stuff, to be able to, if what we talk about with the other systems, with both the service and the production system, is how we do business, then what we're talking about with the support system is how we run the business. Okay, so those are the two aspects of those worlds. Now, for those of you who are out there, you can see that some of these processes, right, are things that you may do in your organizations, right? Some of you may be involved. Everybody in any business is involved in ordering. Okay, and so there are some analogs here that you want to say, or if you're in a hospital system, or a doctor's office, or you have some kind of appointing system, which equates to a reservation system inside of a restaurant. Okay, and so we're going to take out of all of that, I'm going to begin with the reservation system. It's probably the system that most people have contact with. Now, it's not universal in the restaurant business. Obviously, if you go to, McDonald's, they don't have a reservation process, right? You're just ordering whatever you're ordering, and they control the demand in their organization a little bit differently in their restaurant. So, we're kind of going to use a full service kind of example here, where you go and you sit at a table. Okay. And so the primary function of that approach, right? The thing that it's trying to answer, as I said earlier, is that it's about providing access to assure that our customers get a table, right? People want to eat and they want to get a table. And more importantly than just them getting a table, or as equally as important, is how we control the demand placed on the restaurant, right? Because the restaurant there's always constraints in everything that we do. And so how do we control that demand that's coming in so that we can provide the best customer experience that we can possibly provide to the folks that want to come see us. And so one of the ways that that gets done is through a reservation process. And so, you know, most restaurants have some hybrid of this, but we're going to do that because we're going to separate our day part. We're going to separate our section of, you know, lunch or dinner into those components, and we're going to assign times for the number of people that we can seat in that restaurant at any given moment, right? And so we're going to have to create a system for that. And that system can take on a great many things. I remember back in the day, 1,000 years ago, we used to keep all of these things on ledgers, right? We didn't have electronic reservation systems. And so we did that way. And it was with a pencil, and you put people in and you put in the times and you had them separated out. But now things obviously have become more sophisticated over time. And so we have all kinds of different ways that you can get at the reservation system. Typically it was on the phone, but now we have online, we have apps, you can make a reservation in person. There's a number of different ways to be able to get at a vehicle, to be able to get at appointing. All right, so we get to deployment and who uses it, right? So you want to make sure that the system, right, this reservation system is used by everybody. That somebody doesn't have some shadow reservation system going on in your restaurant that nobody knows about, and all of a sudden people show up, and you didn't know they were coming. And so you want to make sure that all the staff and the customers, right? This is about educating customer groups as well. So the staff uses the system, they understand how it works, but your customers know how to access it and how it works, right? You can do that through training, web links, you know, that kind of education with regards to your system. And then, is it used by everyone, right? That's what the big deal is here with regards to deployment. Does everybody know how to use it? Does everybody know how it works? Does everybody, now you may have subject matter experts that deal with it and manage it from a more hands-on approach, but everybody in the system uses it. So if somebody calls on a phone, says, hey, I want to seat, you know, I want to make a reservation for 4 people at 7 o'clock. Everybody knows that that's the system that has to be utilized. You know, learning, how is it improved over time, right? We're going to get customer feedback in that system, right? Those are the kinds of system we're going to get. Hey, how did this work for you? We're going to ask that in some customer surveys. We're going to look at the metrics associated, and this is where we're going to get into LeTCI. We're going to look at the metrics that we've established to be able to tell whether or not this process is working well. And not only how it's working well with regards to ourselves, but how it's working well with others. How are other people doing this? Maybe somebody's got a better idea than we have to be able to implement this, and they've found a better way to reserve tables or a better way to capture the information. What's also contained here with regards to learning is whether or not it's an innovation, right? Whether or not you've got something that's unique to you that you're leading the industry with. And so that kind of starts to play into what we're dealing with regards to learning, because if it's, in order to know that it's innovative, you have to look at other systems to be able to understand whether or not that's happening. And then the interconnectedness with the other restaurant systems, or integration, right? It informs the other systems of the organization, right? So if we're controlling demand, then we know how to schedule in the kitchen, and we know what we need to order for food on any given day, right? We order a little bit differently for Monday through Wednesday than we order through Thursday through Sunday. And so it affects our ordering. It affects our kitchen prep scheduling, right? It affects how we schedule how much food we're going to make that day, and what kinds of food we'll even make that day. And even by day part, you know, we may make some things for lunch that we don't do for dinner. And then how we seat the restaurant, right? All of us have experienced coming in, and you come into a restaurant and you see empty tables, right? You see empty tables. But they don't seat you right away, and that's because they're controlling the demand on the kitchen, because the kitchen is really the production system is limited in by time, and it takes time to produce product, and the equipment has so much capacity. I'm not going to get into all that, but it affects the seating of the restaurant, affects how food comes out of the kitchen, and so that's where that is. So ADLI. That's our introduction to ADLI with regards to the system itself. Now, with regards to seeing whether or not things are working well, we've got LeTCI, right? And it's a great acronym, because now we're going to go see what's going on, right, with our process and how that's happening. And so we have performance, it's specifically designed to look at performance assessment, right? It's specifically designed to look at whether or not you're doing this and how you put your metrics together to tell you, to give you the information that you need. So levels, right? The L, levels tells you what your current performance levels are, and are the scales appropriate? Are you measuring something in seconds that should be measured really in hours? And how do you do that? What's the appropriate level that you're putting in to your metric? Does it tell you what it's supposed to tell you? And does it give you the information that you're supposed to get? The trends, right? How do you do over time, right? Because, just looking at how I'm doing today tells me about today, but it doesn't tell me if I'm good against previous. And so we start to look at comparisons, right? Comparing to ourselves, right? Because we can compare to ourselves or we can compare to others. We start to look at trends, and that really is about looking at ourselves over time. And are we moving in the right direction? Are we achieving the goals that we want to achieve? Are our efficiencies, right? Are our efficiencies where they need to be? And then we've got comparisons, right? Are we looking at our competitors from outside the industry? I mean, inside of our industry, restaurants that are like us. Are we looking at restaurants that aren't like us, that have the similar kinds of systems? But more importantly, are we looking at organizations that have similar types of processes, but we can use the analog to be able to tell us performance, right? So we can use out of industry comparisons. Like I can use, a doctor's office, or I can use a hospital, or I can use, some other system to be able to compare the performance of my reservation system. I can use other types of reservation systems to quote, if I can use those kind of appointing systems to be able to measure whether or not I'm doing well. There may be some nuances there. And then finally, integration is whether or not the metric ties to what's most important. So in our organizational profile, if you were here for that series, in our organizational profile, we really talk about what's important to us. And so when we look at the metrics that we have in the organization, do they measure the things that are important to us? Are the appropriate segmentations of business there? Can we do that? So, are we segmenting appropriately by process, day part in a restaurant, right? Lunch or dinner? Customers that we may have, different types of customers that we have, different stakeholders of the workforce itself. And so that all encompasses LeTCI. I put an example up here with regards to widget performance, right? To be able to see what that is. And so when we go back to our restaurant example, right? One of the things I looked at was, what's an appropriate thing to be able to really talk about in the restaurant. And so we use this metric, restaurants use this metric, which is seat turnover rate. How many times I turn over a seat in a restaurant? My restaurant may be, in this example, my restaurant may be open for 5 hours. It takes an hour and 15 minutes for each chair to turn in the restaurant, which gives me about 4 turns per shift, right? Per day part, right? So if I have 100 seats in my restaurant, I turn it over, if I turn it over 4 times, my capacity is 400 seats, okay? And so I can compare that to the number of covers, right? The number of covers is the number of people that are served in a restaurant. I can compare that to the number of covers, and I can see whether or not I'm achieving that how close I'm getting to that four turns, right? And so for the example over here, our restaurant, our level is 4.3 seat turns per shift, right? I'm only looking at dinner here. I'm only looking at a restaurant that does dinner. I'm not looking at both day parts. And so we're getting 4.3 turns, right? We have a 100-seat restaurant. We're getting 4.3 turns. Our trends over time from 2021 to 2025 have increased from 3.8 to 4.3 turns. So we're turning our restaurant more often, and it's a super number, right? We have 400 seats, but we're getting a little bit more out of it than we would than the goal, right? And that gets into something called seat turnover efficiency, but I'm not getting into that because that's really complex calculation to be able to deal with that. So we're going to compare ourselves to other organizations, right? These are the 2 lines that are on the chart. And so other restaurants, the average for other restaurants is 3.5 turns. But best in class, right? What we're looking at is, are we good against who's the best at this? Best in class is 4.0. And so we're starting to approach in these cases, we're starting to approach an area where we're going to be doing better, where you can see from our performance, we're starting to either equal to or getting to a point that best in class, we're achieving best in class status. And then integration, right? That drives performance and it informs, right? Because we know what our turnover rates are. It starts to inform what we're doing as far as scheduling of our staff, what we're doing with regards to prepping in the kitchen and production, how that's all linked to be able to achieve the goals that we want to achieve, which is at the end of the day, any restaurant is really to sell food, right? And so so we're going to link those metrics. Even more importantly, we're going to link those metrics, like I said, things like seat turnover efficiency or average revenue per check, or chair rent, or labor costs. We're going to do that. We're going to link that metric, and we're going to integrate that metric with other metrics. They're all interrelated because they're all trying to solve this one problem that we have, which is how do we get people in the store, and how do we make sure that we're controlling production so we don't overwhelm the other systems we have. And so how LeTCI and work together, right? So these two things work together. ADLI's really process. So when you think ADLI, think process. Okay, how do you do it? What do you do? How do you do it? How consistently is it used across the organization? Has it been improved, and what's it linked to? What other systems does it? What other processes does it touch? And then LeTCI, how do we know? That's the primary question that we're trying to answer. How do we know that it's working well? How do we know that it's important and appropriate to be measuring? What are we doing over time? How are we doing over time with regards to our own performance? And then how are we doing with our performance compared to other folks, other folks in our industry or even out of industry? And so, ADLI and LeTCI, they're not just for business. You can use it for your own personal health and finance and productivity. You can design a budget with it and stick to it. You can deploy it. And reflect and adapt with learning. We can align with other goals. Does it align with our goals? And then how do we measure it? How do we measure our savings, our spending, our trends, benchmarks? How do we do that? So it's not just for business. You can use it in your personal life. So I'm going to leave you with this. All right. So, and it's really kind of two questions, right? So what's one process in your work or personal life that you could use to evaluate using ADLI, whether or not you've got an approach, you've deployed it well, you know it's working because you've learned from it, and you've got it integrated with other systems? And how would you review the results of that process with regards to LeTCI? So over the next 5 weeks after this today, we're going to be going into deep dive with each one of these. And so so I hope that you stick with us for the whole series. And that's it in a nutshell. I'll take whatever questions we got, Laura.
All right. We don't have any questions in the chat yet, Roland. So what I'm going to do is I was typing feverishly while you were going over your the details. I'm going to go ahead and read the recap, and you can tell me if I've missed anything. I'd like to also open it up to the attendees, that if they do have some questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll queue them up for Roland to address. But this is what I collected, Roland. ADLI stands for Approach, Deployment, Learning, and Integration, and it establishes how we get the work done. ADLI provides a system for establishing and evaluating organizational processes. Approach is process focused. Deployment is who is using and whether that use is consistent across the organization. Learning is focused on process improvement based upon listening and observing. Integration is how processes interrelated with other processes. So that's ADLI. And then I have LeTCI, stands for Levels, Trends, Comparisons, and Integration. And it identifies how well the ADLI processes are working. LeTCI provides us with a technique for establishing and evaluating organizational performance measures. ADLI and LeTCI work together. They create a leadership framework that is a closed system of continuous improvement. I did note also that the examples during this training will be focused on restaurant processes, such as the reservation system. There are various groupings of these systems. We called out the front of the house, the back of the house, and then the support system, which is basically management. Roland spoke a little bit about the reservation system and how you turn your chairs. Integration of all of these disparate systems, whether they be back, front, or management systems, are key. That integration is key because each system, directly or indirectly, will have an impact on the other system. And the example that Roland used was food prep and how we might not need as much food on certain days of the week as other food that would be required on different days. Metrics are key for identifying how well the organization is performing. We rely on metrics to take proactive steps to make necessary adjustments. And that's where LeTCI comes into play. It's important to have a very good alignment between ADLI and LeTCI to ensure that we make necessary adjustments that allow us to achieve our objectives. Did I miss anything, Roland? Or
Oh, I think you got it all. I think that's exactly right. Like I said earlier, it's about, from an organizational standpoint, how do I establish the processes that I need to solve the problems that I'm trying to solve, right? The customer requirements that I may have, the things that I want to achieve, right? What am I trying to produce? And then how do I know any of that's working, right? That's really where the piece is. And that's where LeTCI comes in, right? Where are the metrics that I have associated with that? How do I know I'm doing well over time? How am I doing against others, other competitors? How am I doing that? And how am I improving that? And how is all of that really integrated, right? They all work together. We all know that processes are in the work environment are supposed to be seamless, right? You're not supposed to see the differences between them. They're supposed to flow one into the other to be able to achieve this ultimate outcome that we're trying to achieve. And in restaurants, that's to sell food, right? And so how do we do that? And so the processes are integrated, but also the metrics are integrated as well, so that they feed into each other. They each tell some story to another to be able to achieve what it is that you want to achieve.
right. Okay. Just as a reminder, we are recording this session. We'll record all of the sessions. They will be available on the sterlingcouncil.com website in the Summer Learning Series folder. So feel free to go out there. I'll also have my summary typed up and available with this as well, along with any questions, Q&A that comes through that we weren't able to get to today. But looks like we still don't have any questions in queue. I saw one came through in regard to the recording. Anyone have any questions on ADLI or LeTCI? Process and results. ADLI is process, LeTCI is results. It's a closed system of continuous improvement when we're looking at our results and leveraging those results to make enhancements to our process. So we do have a question. Roland, how can we use this system in the healthcare?
Okay, so we're talking about the system and we're talking about ADLI and LeTCI, right? Then, in healthcare, we have, instead of having a reservation system, right? Instead of having that, we have an appointment system, right? People aren't, with very few exceptions in healthcare, things are appointed, right? We give people a time slot to be able to come in. And so the approach that you take to that, right? The process that you use to be able to appoint people into your doctor's office or into your outpatient clinic or wherever that may be, that the approach is the same. I mean, it's not the same, but it's an analog, right? We know that we got to give somebody a time that they can come in to do something that they want to do at some future date or some future time. And so we use that to be able to, okay, do we have an approach for this, or are we just taking people as they come in off the street, right? That does kind of happen in ERs, right? Where we take people that just come in the street. The system's demand is not necessarily controlled until you get into it. And then there's some triage that goes on and some prioritization of customer and the whole ball of wax, right? And so it's a little bit different. But in most cases, we use some kind of approach to be able to do that. We schedule surgeries, we schedule procedures, we schedule, doctor's visits, we schedule that. And so there's the analog there from one to the other. So do you have an approach to be able to deal with that demand? Who uses the system outside the organization, inside the organization? Is everybody using the same process, or is somebody keeping some piece of paper somewhere in some clinic somewhere and doing whatever they want to do? And so you got to know that that's how that's done. It's also the imparting of the learning in that particular area, right? So deployment always also assumes that it says, I've got this approach that I teach everybody how to use it, right? That's part of deployment, is informing both the customers and the staff that that's what's going on. And so you can see how those two things work. And then learning is really about, is it working well? Are we doing well? Is it achieving what we want to achieve? Are there some improvements that we can make with it? And then integration is, how does it work with the rest of the system, right? How do we inform the folks that are doing the procedures, say in anesthesiology, or with the step down unit, or whoever it is, we're informing them, hey, we've got all this stuff today, you need to staff up for that, because we got all these customers coming in today, we've got all these patients coming in today to be able to take care of that. And then how well all those systems work, right, I would ask you, is how do you measure it? What are the measurements that you're using to be able to tell whether your process is working? Because none of us as leaders can observe every single transaction in our organizations to make it feasible. So we need to use metrics. That's what they're for, is to give us an overall view of how those processes are working. It may not tell us exactly what's wrong, but it may tell it, or what's right, but it will tell us that something is going on that we need to take a deeper dive into.
Roland, I know in your organization, you've created a very mature approach to leveraging results, LeTCI, in support of adjusting your ADLI, your processes, and the systems you have in play. Can you give the audience an example of maybe something that you've done that produced an amazing result, and why that somehow characterizes the importance of truly integrating ADLI and LeTCI as a mindset throughout the organization? Do you have such an example, or am I putting you on the spot?
No, I think okay. So what comes to mind, obviously it's you've still got PTSD from this time frame in the world, but even during the pandemic, right? One of the things that we did was we put up both testing pods, and we put up vaccination pods out in the community. And when we initially did it, right, we had different sections, right? We had laid out the process of how we were going to do this for testing. And so there was some registration process that went on to be able to control the flow of operations. Those folks would come, and they would come into the system, and we would capture that data at the pod, and then they would go on and either be tested by a nurse or be vaccinated by a nurse. And one of the things that we found out very quickly, right, when we were measuring this, was that the queue time, right, when they got to the park, people were waiting in line a long time. The nurses weren't really busy, and the registration staff was going nuts, right? They were overwhelmed. And so what we found when we looked at that and we started to time it out, we did a segmentation of time frame in each one of those sections, right? We measured how long it was taking to do registration, and we measured how long it was to do a vaccination, and then we measured. And so in each one of those sections, one of the things that we found out was it was taking about 3 times longer to do a registration than it was to give a vaccination, right? So we use that metric, right, that cycle time metric, segmented down to each one of those components, to be able to determine that it was taking 3 times longer to do registration than it was to do that. And so in order to fix that problem, so we wouldn't have a backup, what we did is that we threw 3 more registration people into the system for every nurse that we had. And that resource balanced the entire system. The nurses were always busy. The registration folks were always busy. We knew how many people each registration clerk could take, so we staffed the registrations and the nurses appropriately to the demand that was being provided at each pod. And so we were able to get as much throughput as we possibly could. We maximized the throughput for each pod. Now, we didn't have an unlimited number of people we could use for that, but we definitely balanced it. And if we needed more, we opened a pod, then we'd open a second one or a third one or a fourth one with regards to that. Did that work? Good example?
provided me an understanding. We do have, I'm hoping, I liked it. Let's see, we do have another question. Are there any resources that you might recommend to identify best practices for various industries? And I'd like to start that one out. Roland did give an example of something he did that was very unique to his organization in order to make an enhancement. The beauty of this framework, leveraging ADLI and LeTCI, is that it is just that. It's a framework. And it really is fungible across all industries. As far as reference material, there's a lot of very good books out there. If you're in healthcare, the Quint Studer book is a really good book. Hardwiring Excellence, that's a very good book. And so maybe what we'll do, since we're being asked for best practices, I'll work with the Sterling Council and we'll pull together a list of books and perhaps YouTube videos and things that you can leverage to try and get a leg up on some of the material that Roland and I are covering here. But again, the Sterling leadership framework is just that. It's a leadership system that senior leaders, and it comes from the top down. It doesn't really work in the middle. You have to have buy-in from the top down to really put it in an optimal state of adoption throughout the organization and really leverage all of the goodness that can be optimized through adoption of the framework. Roland, did you have anything else to add there? We will.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, benchmarking. I understand the question. Benchmarking is probably one of the more challenging things to do inside of inside of the system, right? The things that make organizations unique, they kind of keep close to the chest, especially in private industry, right? So if you're in public sector, you can go ask anybody, it's all public record. But out in I want to say the real world, but we operate in the real world. Out in private industry, proprietary systems become extraordinarily difficult to benchmark because people like to keep those things as trade secrets. And so it becomes a little bit more challenging to be able to do that. And so I saw somebody put in the chat, which is absolutely correct, which is where I was going to go, is that one of the things that you find is that folks that have gone through this process, organizations that have gone through the process of Sterling, have applications, and we share organizations that have achieved, GSA or Oglethorpe status, are the Governor Sterling Award. I'm sorry, I used an acronym there. I'm trying not to do that. Those organizations are extraordinarily positioned in a place to be able to look for benchmarks, right? They've already been established as best, they kind of, because of those two recognition systems, they've already kind of been established as best in class, with regards to that, are very high performing organizations. And so you can look for those approaches in those organizations by, sometimes asking them for their application, and you can look for those kinds of things, or creating a relationship, because benchmarking is really about a relationship that you create with other organizations, and asking them how well you do and sharing some of your best practices as well. So that's always a challenge. That's always been a challenge with regards to that. Benchmarking is that way. So I appreciate the question. I wish I had some like clearinghouse that I could provide you with, that this would, that you could go look. And some industries do have that. But the level of maturity, for lack of a better term, in some of these areas with some of these industries is going to be spotty, just because people want to keep those things close to the chest. So.
Very good. All right, well, I am not seeing any more questions in our queue, so we can wrap it up for the day. I appreciate everyone joining. Just as a reminder, we are putting the video recording and the summary notes out on the sterlingcouncil.com webpage for the summer learning series, so you can access them there. And we will meet again next Wednesday, same place, same time, same Zoom link. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.